I'm very pleased to welcome to us Terri Coates, who is known to us through her Call the Midwife work, but is also a midwife, a lecturer, writer and clinical editor, and she's been a practicing midwife for some time. Should I say the year? 1982. And advises on the BBC television series Call the Midwife. I'm reliably informed this is one of the few midwife programmes that midwives like. Am I right? Yeah. So I don't want to waste any of your time, Terri. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you everybody for staying. It's really nice to see so many of you still here, and I think we all ought to say thank you very much to Neil Stewart's Associates and all of the sponsors for today, because it's been really good. And I think what has probably kept me going through all these years of midwifery is really good education. And I think without days like this to stimulate us and inspire us, I think, it would be very easy to get very tired and worn out. I think we need days like this to come and meet other midwives. I was asked to talk about a journey to Call the Midwife, and it's certainly been fairly long, really. But you can see here that we've got Neil Street Productions, BBC One, and from the Royal College of Midwives to Call the Midwife, from the RCM to CTM. And it is a fairly long and drawn-out procedure to get a programme actually on the TV. Let's start, okay. This is most people's idea of what a midwife is. It certainly was a few years ago. A bit of a batlax, carrying babies and looking really cross. And I can remember the medical students in Liverpool when I was a midwifery sister there. They made a sign and they put it outside the labour ward, and they said midwives parking area, and they put broomsticks there. That really didn't help. So I think midwives have had a bad press on the whole, and that was at a time when I thought really the only idea of a midwife was Sarah Gamp from Dickens, and cartoons like this one by Giles. Well, I don't like a challenge. I love a challenge. And going back just one step, before I was a midwife, I trained as a general nurse, and I trained here at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, before they all went up the hill to the new Radcliffe. And I think that gave me a sense of place and history. But I've always loved history, and I've always loved stories, and I've always loved the stories about people's health and about practice. And although dreadful as they were, I did read Mills and Boon. And I love the stories about nurses and doctors, and I love the stories about how people perceived nurses. But I could never find stories about midwives, and I did look. That was until halfway through my nurse training, I was lucky enough to do an obstetric certificate, which in 1977 was actually 3 months obstetrics at the Radcliffe. And I had a really inspired and inspiring midwifery tutor called Jill, and I'm dying of shame because I haven't remembered her name for a very long time, apart from the fact that it was Jill, and I was so surprised that I was allowed to call her Jill when nobody else called anybody by their first name. It was all sister and yes and no. But it was Jill, and Jill told us all to go and read The Cry and the Covenant by Morton Thompson. Now, this is the copy of the book that I bought in 1977, and it was published in 1969, and it's all about puerperal sepsis, and it is so clearly and evocatively written, and it moved me beyond anything I'd ever read. And because it was all about mothers and babies. And I knew then, at that point, having done 3 months obstetrics and actually being allowed to deliver a baby, that this was what I wanted to do. And I couldn't believe that such writing, you wouldn't believe that cover, would you? I couldn't believe that such writing would move me, and it still haunts me. And I stupidly read it again when I was pregnant with my first. I really shouldn't have done. Didn't do me any good at all. So what I did was I looked for other books that talked about midwives and midwifery. I really didn't find any. And I thought, well, I'll find them eventually. And I carried on reading voraciously. I've always had an amazing appetite for reading books and things about midwifery. And I carried on looking for things that would be midwifery based. Now I'm going to take this back one because that needs to be done. From nursing to midwifery to the advanced diploma in midwifery, and then onto a master's degree. And it wasn't until I did a master's degree when my own children were 4 and 6 years old that I finally felt that I had time to read some books. And that was because during a master's degree, I'd got almost no time to myself with small children and a real desire to read something about midwives and midwifery. And in the end, in the middle of an MSc, that's the last time you think or place you think that you're going to be able to read a novel. And I just had this yearning to read a novel. And I became a real pain. I was asking book clubs, bookshops, libraries, librarians, and the internet really was still in its infancy, and I really had to scrape the barrel to find books about midwifery. And I told my tutor I was going to write about the midwife in literature. And I had 8,000 words, and I had no books. I had no stories about midwives. And I was beginning to think I was going to have to look for books in other languages. And then I started reading just about any birth ever mentioned in any book. And then it was any book and any article, and I was really scraping the barrel. I really had problems looking for anything written in the English language. Paula Yates wrote about birth because she was a really hotshot young thing and was on the TV. And she wrote about her midwife and said that the midwife was really useful for plugging in the heated rollers. Yeah, so, we weren't getting a very good line in people's memoirs and books, but it was at about that level. Nobody wrote about it. It was a bit like trying to find undertakers in books. We just didn't exist. There was the Edith Bagnold, who wrote The Squires. Anybody read that? No? And there was Tristram Shandy and Kitty in Tolstoy, in Anna Karenina, but very few. So I started writing about the lack of midwives in literature, and it became an 8,000-word rant about the lack of midwives in literature, which was then cut down for 1,500 words, a bit less of a rant, and it was published in the relaunched Midwives RCM journal, Midwives, and that was a new launch in January of 1998. So it was finished in 97, published in 1998. And it sort of struck a chord with lots of midwives. And one of the people who read it and said, yes, this is what I really feel, this is what I want to do, was a woman called Jennifer Worth. And she sent me her handwritten manuscript about a year later. And the stories leapt off the page. But she'd only been a midwife for a very short time. And she'd misremembered a lot of her midwifery. So over 15 years, I worked with her as her clinical editor. And it was found eventually by Matthew Paris. The Call the Midwife book was found by Matthew Paris, and then the other books. And they got to the top of the Times bestseller list. Now that takes a while. We're talking about from 1998 through to about 2004. And then once Matthew Paris had written about it, then the BBC took it up, and it took 4 years from Matthew Paris's article and the BBC taking it up to actually getting a script. So it takes a while. Sadly, Jennifer died 2 weeks before we started filming, but she had wanted me to be her on-set advisor, which was probably quite a good thing because she only did about a year's midwifery, including her training. But she did know how to tell a good story. Okay, so for those of you who think I've got a jammy job and who think that it's really, really glamorous, what I'd like to do is to show you that. That is the entrance to the film set. It gets better. If, like me, you're used to working in the NHS, you're used to clean and tidy. Tidy it is, but tidy in its own way. Clean it certainly isn't, but it is organised, and it takes about 120 people, 12 hours to film about 4 minutes of TV. Okay, so it is done with minute precision. And if I take you through the door into a corridor, that doesn't look like an NHS corridor. It looks like when you do your MLE, it looks like the bad one that you're supposed to say, no, it can't look like that. There's cables all over the place. Now that's quite well lit inside, but most of the time it's really, really dark. It's really dark. So we do have problems because you have to be able to see where you're going, but nothing stays in the same place for any one time. And the reason it's dark is because all the windows are blacked out, and we shine lights on it to get the exact level of daylight. And the exact level of daylight is then maintained all the way through the day because it takes such a long time to film. We can't rely on the daylight being exactly right. But I still make beds. I take 6 months of the year off from clinical practice, but I still make beds. This is one of the beds that we do use, and as you can see, there's a huge hole in the mattress, but that has been torn. It's all stained, but it's stained on purpose. And the ticking on the covers of the pillows have been added, but they are really saggy. The Welcome Unit for the History of Medicine were mortified to hear that we used real 1950s newspapers, and we try and make things as accurate and absolutely spot on as possible, which means that we do an awful lot of research. And okay, so this is a very accurate portrayal of a bed. In fact, what the director wanted us to do after we'd done this setup of the bed is to remove 1 or 2 of the pillows. She didn't want the woman to be seen to have too many pillows and to be too comfortable. So we used the bed as it was, but removed the pillows. We now, in the later episodes, don't use newspaper because what happens if you sit on newspaper? It crackles really badly, and the sound department hated it with a passion. So we now use something similar to the old rubber Macintosh, and then put gamgee, cotton wool, on top of it. So it is appropriate for the time, but they would have put newspaper and brown paper underneath, but they didn't have the sound department to contend with as well. Now, you can see at the back something that looks like a huge metal arm, and that's actually the camera trolley, which is called a dolly. And we put the camera on the dolly and it moves up and down. You'd think that we had several cameras when we were doing this, but we in fact only use one. And so if you're filming something, you film me, you then have to film it again from that side and again from that side. So, it takes a long time. And every time they stop the camera and do it again, the hair and makeup come in and they carry on. So it takes a long time to do everything. It's done with immense precision and love and care. The other thing is that none of the people that play the midwives or the women in labour, none of them have any idea of what a midwife does or how she does it. And most of the young women that play, the actresses that are in labour, they have no idea of how labour is, apart from when they see an overblown Hollywood-style labour. So I hope that we've toned it down so that nobody screams unless they really scream. So we don't have screaming with every contraction. I hope that we show midwives looking like caring, empathetic professionals rather than people that sit around drinking tea because they've been edited that way on One Born Every Minute. And we don't have women looking like they're fresh as a daisy because that's what the makeup department wanted them to look like. They need to look wrung out. They need to look like they've worked very hard at pushing this baby out. There are things that I can't do with the babies when I deliver them. We can do it again, but sometimes if you're passing them under a sheet, they dry out as you pass them underneath. So they don't always end up as wet and sticky as they start off. But there's occasionally we can add wet in later, but it's a several-person production. I also do drug rounds. We still have to make sure that any drugs that we use are appropriate for the time in the right containers. And you can see there's some very old medicine bottles, and they are genuinely very old medicine bottles and old drug containers. So we try and do it as accurately as humanly possible. And we do use old prams and old equipment. So we try and do it as carefully and as accurately as possible. Now these prams, they look wonderful, but a lot of them have to be nailed back together again and screwed back together again, because they're not as hardy as you'd hope. And they look fairly clean, but that we do have to put very clean sheets back on them. If they don't look good, it's because they've been dyed to look grotty. We do use old blankets and old sheets, but sometimes we have to make them look worse than they are. And you'll recognise the old screens as well. We use real babies on the set. For the births, we try and use very small premature babies, and for the chunkier, healthier ones in the clinic, we try not to make them so big that they don't fit on the scales, and that baby very nearly didn't. That director there, as a point of feminism, that director there, she's called Philippa Lothorpe, and she was the first woman ever to get a BAFTA for direction. And that was for the first Christmas episode of Call the Midwife 3 years ago. So, you know, it really is right up there with the high rollers. The production company, Neil Street, are also, it's Sam Mendes' production company, and he directs the Bond films. So he's the producer for the Bond films. So it's actually a pretty good stable. If you're going to have to work for a production company as your first, it's pretty good. But this is the sort of thing I get up to, which is usually getting absolutely soaking wet. You think that people in film productions wear black because it's cool. Well, actually, no, it's black because it's usually filthy. You've got a bed there that is up on blocks and with me underneath it, and they're handing me a doll so that we can test it out with the doll. But this was the birth that was the master, and the master ran a pub and he died of TB, and in the room next to him dying of TB, his daughter gave birth kneeling at the side of the bed. And this is me going under the bed so that my head and shoulders were out, and I had to have first a doll at arm's length so we can practice, then a prosthetic which weighs nearly 5 kilos because they're very heavily weighted, and with all the water running down my arms, like this, and then a baby, and they invariably wee. So it's not glamorous. If you think you get wet and mucky doing births in the NHS, try that. It's really filthy. Yeah. I didn't know that picture was being taken of me, but I'm glad it was. It shows how awkward it is, as I say, but certainly not glamorous. But because we spend a lot of time and trouble getting the detail of the birth right, I think that's why midwives appreciate it. And we show birth in all sorts of different positions. We show birth semi-recumbent, sitting, lying, left lateral, kneeling, all fours, any position that a woman gets into. And one of the most unpleasant ones that I ever dealt with was a birth in a fish shed, and they used real fish, which was fine at 7 o'clock in the morning when they got the fish fresh from Billingsgate, but by middle of the day when the lights had been on it for a while, it was truly awful because the oil dripped off the kippers and we all had to go and shower. It was really awful. But we've completed the filming of the birth, and a few people had to go away to just recover, but it was, you know, they do try and get the absolute detail as correct as possible. And that means that I get the scripts at the storyline level. So they start with a story, then they give you a long essay, then they do a basic script, and I get it at each stage. So it means that if they start doing really silly things, and they can do really silly things. I was at a script meeting the other day where a director told me that they needed a drip in this woman's arm because she lost lots of water all the way through her labour. And how else would you replace the water that she was losing? Well, it's that level of knowledge that you're dealing with. People at the bus stop don't understand their bodies. They don't understand the physiology of labour. They do understand how to make films, but I have to step in and make sure that what is going up on their screen, what they're filming, is clinically plausible. And luckily, they trust me to do that. And I hope I am trusted by midwives to portray our profession in an appropriate way. I am also trusted with the babies on the set. We have very new babies and very new mums. And although we have lots of them, we try and get them as twins because they tend to be smaller. Even babies that are born at 3.5 kilos look too big. They look ridiculously big when you put them next to skinny little actresses, and they really are thin. They're not like normal healthy women. They do seem to be very small, which means that their bumps are an appropriate size for them, but then you put a 3.5 kilo baby next to them and it looks like they've given birth to a 4-month-old child. This baby was supposed to be slightly older, so it wasn't so much of a problem. This baby did want to be at that angle and would only stay at that angle. Anyway, we had a nice time. The BBC are also very proud of this production. They have sold it to, last year it was 197 countries, and I've heard this year it's to 212 countries. So it's sold all over the world, and it has an impact all over the world. Telling stories about birth is very important, and it's also a very good way of teaching people. And we notice that there is a spike on the NHS website every time we go and tell a story about a particular disease. So the NHS website are now aware that this happens and they're ready. So, the effects of what we do, of telling appropriate stories and telling them well, we need to make sure that we're clinically accountable, that we're professionally accountable, or I'm professionally accountable, and we get it right. So it isn't just a story, it isn't just fiction. All the stories that we tell, they're first-hand accounts, and we only use first-hand accounts. It might be fictionalized because a story about something that happened in 2012, we have to transfer it to whatever year we're filming, and we're now up to 1962. I also weigh babies. They're spring balance things. We seem to only have broken ones, and the springs come right down to the bottom, which means that the actresses have to hold them right up here. And sometimes we film in very small rooms. You can see there a whole film crew and the sound guy in a very small space, and that was because it was a very small room, and it was up at the top of the house, and I think it got to about 38 degrees later that morning. It was incredibly hot. See, everybody looked slightly pink. Well, it does on my screen, but we really all were very hot. I also get to work with some very, very, very good people, and those twins were born at 34 weeks. They were 6 weeks old, and yes, I do have the permission of their mum to use the pictures, because when they're on the set, they have to sign release for publicity shots. But they are all so well looked after, and all the staff, all the actors and actresses, and all the staff on the set, they do so enjoy having the babies around, and you get these huge, hairy guys that carry enormous heavy bits of equipment around, and suddenly they see a baby and they go all soft and, and quiet. It does have an amazing effect. You put a 2.5 kilo baby in front of a 6'8" rigger, and they just do different things. We go out on location, which means that all the equipment that we use on the film set, we have to take with us in huge, great white vans. You think you have a lot to carry as community midwives. Well, you'd be surprised. The top one is getting ready to do the birth in the car. The second one is the really glamorous T-stop, coming round the green car that we used for the birth, which meant that the front seats were taken out, and I had to lie across all of the bolts and things to get the baby to the right position. The Eastgate Dairy's milk, anybody remember school milk? Yeah, well, that's paint. But that's Chatham Dockside, and it's not often that Chatham Dockside is that glamorous. Normally it's grey and windy and oh so cold. Yeah. And more aspects of the job I do. So I'm very, very fortunate. It's been very hard work. We're just about to start filming the 6th series of Call the Midwife. I've been delighted that people have come up to me during the day, have peered at my badge and said, oh, and told me stories. It's been lovely. Thank you very much. I'm always very happy to hear midwives' birth stories and mothers' birth stories. And as long as they're first-hand birth stories, I'm very happy to take them to the writer. You can see from the pictures of people around that they're always delighted to be with the babies. Their babies are always treated incredibly well. Even when the background looks dreadful, we try and keep it as clean and as draft-free as possible. The mothers are only ever a few feet away, and I always spend time talking with them before we go onto the set, so they have an idea of what to expect. The babies are paid, not the mothers, and the mothers are very well looked after. But this is what we're all aiming for, whether it's a healthy mother and a healthy baby in reality, which is what we do as midwives, or a healthy mother and a healthy baby dramatically. Everybody likes a happy tale, and I hope you enjoy watching Call the Midwife for a long time. I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, I'm a midwife from Ipswich, and I got to know Helen Worth's book. It must have been when it was just published. It was a lady I looked after on the community who bought me it with pictures of her baby throughout, and I've treasured that ever since. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is, this is my husband's favourite programme, and every Sunday I have to watch it with him. And he never forgets to remind me what a wonderful job I have and how jealous he is. And he was a marine engineer all his life, but every Sunday I get glorified for about 2 hours afterwards, just to say. So I think everyone,
Your husband sounds like a national treasure. I think they are. Hello.
I'm Diane Garland. Thank you, Terri. We met earlier. I wondered how the production team took to the thalidomide story that you've recently obviously done, and what the reaction was to that thalidomide issue.
For those of you who couldn't hear Diane Garland's question, it was about the crew reaction to the thalidomide story. We knew historically that the thalidomide story was coming up, and we spent about 2 years researching it before we actually started to film it. The first episode of the series was the first introduction of a baby with thalidomide deformities, and we worked very closely with the Thalidomide Association and with all of the photo archives. The baby with the thalidomide deformities was a prosthetic, and it took 4 months in post-production to paste in a real baby's face. And I would defy anybody to see the join, because you can't. The thalidomide infant, the doll, was called Susan. It was treated with the utmost respect. And the man who played her father declined to see the prosthetic beforehand. It was making members of the crew cry. It really was. It was very difficult to work with it. We spent a lot of time talking to the crew beforehand, so everybody was prepared. And we got very used to having Susan, the prosthetic, on the set, as well as the 3 babies who played baby Susan. And it was very upsetting. The actress who played her mother was actually pregnant at the time and needed quite a lot of support. And I mean, that's another place for me as a midwife to sit and talk her through. But she had pictures of her own baby. She knew that her baby's limbs were well formed, even though you think you get all sorts of strange feelings. But the prosthetic took 5 people to work. It had a handle for each limb that moved individually, and it had a balloon in the abdomen that made it breathe. And we filmed it very, very, very carefully. It took a lot of time and effort because we had to position it so carefully that we couldn't see any of the equipment. And then we had to, or then I had to wrap a real baby to pin its arms comfortably so that it didn't move them, so that we couldn't see them in place. And it took, to do the short sequences, it took about 4 or 5 days of 12-hour filming. The babies are only allowed on the set for a very few minutes at a time, and that's why we have 2 or 3 infants. We have twins, so that we've got them for a whole day. What we were very proud of is that I've got a complete brain block. The Science Museum want the prosthetic to show. Yeah, so it's been given to the Science Museum. Cost many thousands of pounds, and we are very delighted. But the Thalidomide Association were very pleased with what we'd shown. And sadly, the court cases are still going on. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I was just wondering what the umbilical cords are. They prosthetics? Or?
Yes, they're prosthetic. They look
They
amazing.
look very good.
They do. They do. And if you leave a little bit in your pocket and wash your jeans, it looks like you've got a slug in your pocket, which is really, which is really horrible. But yes, they're made of silicone, and they actually have 3 vessels running through them, and they're very soft, and they cut and they clamp like real cords. And in post-production, if you think that it's a real baby with a real cord, it's because post-production it is CGI'd onto the abdomen of the baby.
Well, thank you very much, Terri.
Thank you.